So, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our workshop, Thinking Strategically About Impact with Professor Jasjit Singh. My name's Tim Bett, and I'm welcoming you on behalf of the National Alumni Association of the Netherlands. Today, our workshop was actually meant to be one of two major events this week on the theme Act for Impact, from Words to Action. But as you'll probably know, on Thursday's strategy forum in the Hermitage has had to be postponed until the 16th of June. So that's the 16th of June when, because of COVID restrictions. I wish I could say that's when COVID's officially over, but that's when we're next able to schedule a face-to-face meeting, which I would dearly like. However, we can't do face-to-face, and that's why I'm particularly delighted that Jasjit is able to join us from Singapore to lead this workshop. I'm hoping that Jasjit's going to introduce himself more fully in a moment, but to save his blushes, he has many professorial titles, including Professor of Strategy and the Paul de Broel Chair, Professor of Sustainable Development. At INSEAD, Jasjit runs a very popular elective, and many of the alumni, and some of whom are present, will also know him from his short virtual course, Strategy and Investing for Impact. At this moment, I see a number of unfamiliar names on the gallery in front of me, and I'd like to make a warm welcome to the 22 Ds who have tuned in to hear Jasjit and to get a flavor of, I think, the best of what INSEAD can provide. So welcome the 22 Ds. And I'm really looking forward to today's session. Before handing over to Jasjit, there are a couple of administrative points I'd just like to make. One, if possible, if you're decent, we would like you to keep your camera on. We think that makes a better experience all round. Secondly, we'll put you on mute in a moment if you're not already on mute, but when you would like to contribute, interrupt, or when we do some questions and answers, please unmute yourself to speak. Thirdly, there's a chat function. Please use the chat. I've seen Jasjit ask it. How he managed to juggle the chat and speak at the same time, I don't know, but he does. So please put your points or questions in the chat. And fourthly, a recording will be made of today's session, which we will make available both on Jasjit's website, but also on the Netherlands page. So with that, I would like to hand over to Jasjit. Thank you very much. Really appreciate this. And we're looking forward to a great session. Thanks, Jasjit.
Tim, thank you so much for that warm welcome. And a warm hello to the Dutch alumni, as well as a lot of other people who are pretending to be Dutch alumni. It's always nice to be among friends. The good thing is we are INSEAD, we are an inclusive community. So certainly countries know no boundaries. Can I request everybody to just in one line put down their city, their country, and current time? As well as, sorry, what year you graduated and what program, or what are you signed up for? Just for people to get a sense of who's here. Appreciate the honesty, Sebastian. That's great. Super. So hello to everyone. And as you might have seen in the flyer, The title for what I'm talking about today is Thinking Strategically About Impact. And this is something that I've been working and devoting all my attention to over the past 10 years. I've been at INSEAD for 17 years now, but the last 10 years I've been focused exclusively in the impact/sustainable development space. And so this is bread and butter for me, and always a pleasure to have a conversation about this topic. Just a few words about me. First of all, Tim, I don't know how you manage as a Dutch to say my name perfectly. It's not easy. I recognize for people from different countries and languages. So feel free to call me Dr. J if you struggle with that, but you're very welcome to call me Jasjit if you can figure it out. You shouldn't, oh yeah, Tim is in Dutch. Okay, that explains it, Rashmi. So just don't call me professor, it's a bit boring. I'm an engineer by background for my first 6 years. Then I did my MBA, worked for a few years, decided I wanted to be academic, and got my PhD in business economics at Harvard in a joint program between economics and strategy department, and have been at INSEAD since 2004. And it's such a cool place that unless they ask you to leave, why would anybody leave? And thankfully, they didn't ask me to leave. They asked me to stay on. And here I am, intending to be here for another 17. The context of the conversation that I want to have is, let's be honest, a lot of the outside world doesn't really see businesses or business schools as sort of the temples of doing good. And of course, one of the things that we want to work on constantly is to highlight the good things that business does do. For example, just through natural market forces, a lot of the economic development that has happened in the past decades has happened because of business. And certainly there's a lot of people working on at the frontiers pushing the boundaries. And at the same time, of course, we should remain humble and recognize that, yes, indeed, there are a lot of issues, whether it's climate, whether it's inequality, in which business has sometimes inadvertently, sometimes perhaps almost deliberately played a role, and we need to do better to clean up our act. So just a little bit about me. I mean, these are questions that I talk about in my research, which I'm not going to talk too much about directly, but a lot of my thinking I bring in a condensed form from my research, but also more generally how I interpret broader research that's happening and look at the world more broadly as a conversation that I bring into my MBA, EMBA, and alumni courses called Strategy and Investing for Impact. And just last week, I taught in my annual program, which is called INSEAD Social Entrepreneurship Program, which is more for practicing social entrepreneurs and nonprofit leaders and so on. And today, my goal is to give a little bit of a flavor for that. And I had a conversation with the Dutch Alumni Association of people that are here, and they kindly agreed to run it more as a conversation rather than a webinar where only my face is projected. So my hope indeed is that, and that's why we blocked 1.5 hours. I don't intend to throw 1.5 hours of PowerPoint slides at you, but I will do it for about half the time, taking the opportunity to share my ideas, but we will hopefully have time for a significant discussion as well. Once more, I'll repeat Tim's request to keep your cameras on if you can. It just feels a little bit like more like a community. I recognize if you need to step out and so on, you might not be able to do that, but to the extent you can, please do keep your cameras on. So the starting point of course, of the conversation here, from my point of view, is not starting from a position of guilt, right? Hey, we caused the damage, we owe this and so on. I think there's that moral component as well. But to me, it's also about, what kind of life do we want to lead? A lot of times, even if the world from the outside accuses business leaders for only caring about money. We know well that on the inside, people are not like that. And sometimes it's more sort of the systems and the KPIs and the metrics that run our lives that constrain us from doing things we might not completely agree with, but I think this is work in progress, and we do want to have that conversation on at least how do we lead fulfilling lives that we are also happy with and proud of at the end of the day. So normally when people talk about impact versus business, right, very often they have in mind that, okay, I want to have impact. This means I'm going to quit my life as a corporate leader. And in this case, this is a case study that I sometimes teach about, the case study of John Wood, who quits Microsoft and moves to Nepal to open a nonprofit that opens libraries in rural Nepal. Now, in this particular case, he went on to build a truly world-class nonprofit organization. And hence, I use this as a case study on how to do that if I were treating in a nonprofit, if I was teaching in a nonprofit management program. But the focus here is more to highlight two things. The first is, yes, for a lot of people, for a lot of causes, we need the nonprofits. We need the development aid. We need policymakers and all of that, thinking of this as a problem which needs to be separately funded and sufficiently critical that it's worth working on. Importantly, still with the focus on the outcomes and the impact, and with the humility and understanding of the communities you're trying to serve rather than outside-in solutions, right? But the second point I want to remind us is that this is not the only way, right? So it could be that somebody like John Wood decides to stay back in Microsoft and says, okay, how do I more meaningfully contribute to what Microsoft is trying to achieve in a way that's, at least taking a long-term perspective, makes sense for Microsoft, given its goal, its mission, and so on, and also is perhaps more impactful for the world than what I might have been doing, just trying to sell more of the software to the richer people in the world, not thinking about broader societal issues, right? So the focus of the conversation today is not as much on the nonprofits as saying, okay, what about business? And what is the overlap between business and impact? And that's a conversation that I want to have. And as I started, I think there is overlap. Some of it naturally comes from the fact that hopefully in the process of building excellent products and services and generating jobs and so on, you're already contributing to society while also thinking about minimizing your negative externalities to society, even if it's just from the point of view of management of risk, like everybody now talks about when they're talking about ESG, or from concerns about trends about consumers, employees, regulators, and so on, like the big push in EU in recent years towards tightening up the languages that company can use when they're saying green, they're green versus not, and all of that. But more excitingly for me, where passionate people, including lots of MBA students, are saying, how can we come up with new business models, products, approaches that perhaps increase this overlap between how, to use Ilian Miho's words, business can be used as a force for good. And the point here is, again, to say, we are very often capable of really living lives that are much bigger than we give ourselves credit for. And just an inspirational quote from Nelson Mandela to get the conversation going, which is, there's no passion to be found playing small in settling for a life that is less than the one you're capable of living, right? So a conversation about impact is a conversation about essentially, are you contributing your best? Are you living your sort of best possible life in terms of what you can achieve? And yes, there's nothing wrong with having money as a goal and self-care as a goal, and having a goal about having a good life for your family and people around you. At the same time, humans are complex entities. We do also care about what we're doing to the world, and that's naturally a goal that comes into the picture. especially once we've reached certain degree of sort of personal well-being materially, because there's a lot of research even in behavioral economics and psychology that says, yes, money would buy you happiness to some extent, when you're hungry or when you're struggling in life to meet the basic needs. But there's a point beyond which, happiness is not just going from accumulating more wealth. So even from the point of view of personal well-being, I would say thinking of impact is one of the ways people have fulfilling lives. I'm not saying this is the only way, others could be devoting time to their loved ones, to their families, and that's a different kind of impact or different kind of engagement. That is a fulfilling life. But the point is, there's certainly much more to a fulfilling life than just a single metric of how much money did I manage to make. And so the conversation of impact for me is a conversation that starts from that point and saying, okay, it's worth asking yourself the question, how much better is the world because of you, right? And so from that, the definition of impact directly follows. Imagine the world with you in it and the world without you in it. And I recognize, this is a familiar slide to a few of you that have been in my courses before, but it's a useful way of thinking. It seems trivial, but once you start pushing it, it's not trivial anymore, and we don't necessarily act in a way that's consistent with it. And I'm going to just give you a couple of quick examples. The first is, if I go to a house building tour with a nonprofit that builds houses for low-income people in rural Cambodia, as I did, it's great for me to feel good about myself, but an INSEAD professor whose skill is at making colorful PowerPoint slides is normally not the right person to be building houses, right, in terms of allocation of societal resources. And I have to be very careful, when I do something like this, and lots of us do things like this, right? Volunteering in communities at a small level, over after hours and weekends. And that's a great thing. That's a great thing from the point of view of engaging with societal issues, building human-to-human connections, learning about, the challenges perhaps in this particular case, people in Cambodia face. And this trip I went with my younger son. So, I was happy that my younger son was off his iPhone for 3 days in a row, and we were able to engage meaningfully just in getting to know each other more, and he coming back more inspired to contribute positively to the world. At the same time, we have to be very honest. This is not how I'm going to change the world. Hopefully, I'm achieving more than this in other things that I do, because this is just not in line with my skill set. In this particular case, somebody picked me up in an air-conditioned car to take me to rural Cambodia, provided me with chilled bottles of mineral water in a community which perhaps did not have access to clean running drinking water. There was a full-time supervisor making sure that I didn't hurt myself. And there was, of course, the expensive SOS insurance to airlift me directly to a hospital in Singapore in case I did hurt myself, right? So it's important to keep things in context on why are we doing particular things. And so purely in terms of impact, in this particular case, did I have impact? Yes, perhaps, but that was not from building the house, because for sure the next day they got a real house builder to clean up the mess that I created there. But from the fact that for going on this trip, they charged me $1,300, and hopefully they didn't spend more than $300-400 out of that to make me feel good about myself. And there was money left for them to actually fund the excellent programs that this nonprofit organization does run in truly impoverished communities. Just another example on how sort of it can get even worse. This is a study of a couple of parachuting centers in the UK that some academics published a couple of decades ago. And they collected data on volunteers jumping out of planes to raise money. And these are people who would normally not have volunteered to do parachuting, except that, when it was being done for a good cause, they were able to collect their cuts and do it. And in the process, they raised 120,000 pounds. Now, jumping out of planes is a pretty expensive sport, but they still managed to raise after paying for the cost of the jumps, there is 45,000 pounds. And you might say, hey, what is that? Is it worth their time and all of that? And we could have an argument. But then there's others who would say, something is better than nothing, isn't it? Well, yes, but in this particular study, once you add up the numbers, what ended up happening is 163 of them actually injured themselves, costing the UK health system 610,000 pounds. So let's pause for a second, right? You raised 45,000 pounds for societal causes while costing the society 610,000 pounds in direct costs, not to mention, the personal inconvenience to yourself. And, is it really worth it in the bigger scheme, which you might not see because the cost is being picked up by another piece of the society. So you have to think holistically to have the bigger picture in mind. Now, this, very simplistic example, perhaps, actually highlights three things that come up all the time, even in more complex projects. And I'll give you an example of another one in a second. But the three things are, first, what are you achieving? Second, how cost effective are you in achieving them? And the second question is particularly important because in business, we always keep cost in mind. But somehow, when you're doing good, the opportunity cost of resources, time, energy, and money devoted to doing good, people just forget about it, right? People don't consider, could we take the same time, money, resources, energy into something else and achieve more? And the third is the unintended consequences, which very often we are oblivious of. And in this case, it was the broken bones. But just to give another example of what is, today accepted as one of the poster childs of how not to do development, is a project called the Play Pump, which was a social enterprise set up in South Africa in the early 2000s, where the idea was that a social entrepreneur discovered that if you have, he came across a device which was a merry-go-round, but with a pumping mechanism built into it. So that, when kids spin, when the kids play, then there's a pumping mechanism that pulls water out from the ground. And they said, wouldn't this be a wonderful thing to bring this to communities in sub-Saharan Africa and give them access to underground water in a way that's not burdensome? Because it turns out that normally, at least in those years, the whole burden of fetching water, especially if you have to travel to a pond or something and get it home, that task would fall on girls or women. Very often, they would get injured. At a minimum, the concern was women are overworked, girls show up late for school and all of that. So this was one of those wonderful projects where it was like a win-win-win, right? Girls are going to school, women are getting empowered, communities are getting clean drinking water, kids are happy playing. And it was, people got so excited about it that they were able to raise $16 million. And there was ambition to raise 60 million in a 5-year time horizon to roll this project out to 4,000 villages. It was already rolled out to 1,000. And the idea was that the initial funding would be donor funding, and then it will become self-sustaining because in the billboards in this tank that I showed you, the corporates would sort of sponsor that space because the founder of this, Trevor Field, was a retired sales guy. So he knew how to sell billboards space to corporates. And some of the other boards were going to give, public health messages like around AIDS prevention and all of that. So there were so many things to like about it. Not surprisingly, the guy won a World Bank social entrepreneurship competition, and that's what get all of this funding going. It also was a major disaster. The major disaster was on multiple grounds. One was nobody was caring about maintenance because people were crazy on one metric. How many did you install? Nobody was saying, how long did they last? Nobody had the budget to actually make sure that, these things continue to work. The problem also was you don't actually have kids playing for hours and hours, which is what you needed every day. It turns out even poor kids don't like to play on the same play equipment for 5-10 hours a day, and definitely not when their parents tell them go out and play because we need more water, right? And so much so that in some communities there were even charges of it bordering on child labor. There were no corporates to be seen, by the way, for putting these sponsoring the advertising space, because these were not target communities for a lot of corporates. The first few billboards would come in because the corporates could put it in their CSR reports or marketing budgets. And for that, they just needed 2 or 3. That's enough pictures to put in their annual report. They're not going to do it for 100 of those just for that cause. It also turns out that spinning it around again and again is actually very hard to do for adults. And it's also very inefficient. So if the kids are not doing it, even if the play pump is working, it's a much more inefficient way of getting water out of the ground than having a simple hand pump. The other thing here was, very often entrepreneurial ventures in general and social entrepreneurial ventures in particular face this challenge that, things don't work out well, and that's okay, right? So, but the point is, there has to be a feedback mechanism to say, is your solution working? In this particular, there wasn't. And not only was there no feedback mechanism, feedback was actively ignored for a couple of years. For example, UNICEF had in 2007 said there were serious problems, including exploitation of children, and there wasn't clean drinking water available actually in a lot of communities. Despite that, Western funders kept on funding this project, and the people on the ground said, as long as the money is coming and we've committed to installing X hundred of these, we are going to continue doing, to a point that in some communities, the contractors were going in, removing perfectly functioning hand pumps that already existed in the communities, replacing it with play pumps, which then stopped working and the community no longer had access to water, right? And so it goes back to that, fundamental principle of where is the value being created. Now, even let's say if we set aside all of those issues and let's just go back to the basics, the way we would analyze this case in a strategy class, the first question we would ask is, what is the value created and what is the cost of it, right? And a fully installed hand pump, it turns out, is very roughly about $3,000 US. A fully installed play pump is about $15,000 and is far more inefficient than a hand pump, right? So the question you say is, yes, it's a very sexy story. And yes, everybody just wants innovation. But where is the value creation if it's 5 times the cost to build something that's far more inefficient at getting access to clean drinking water? Not to mention, by the way, there was no evidence that the other outcomes from girls attending more school to women getting empowered to and so on were those being realized? Not obvious. If you really cared about giving kids another play equipment, maybe you can build just a separate play equipment for, I don't know, $500 and still give the community $3,000 of hand pump if that's the perfectly functioning solution. And the point again is this distinction between the intentions, because everybody here was well-intentioned, other than perhaps some of the contractors who in the extreme case, just exploited the system. But more fundamentally, you can have good intentions coming from a very good heart. But if you switch off your brain when you're coming to the impact space, very bad things can happen. And in particular, one of the biggest misconceptions that a lot of people new to the impact space have is, hey, doing something is better than doing nothing. And that's actually not true. People who've been in the development space for a lot of time actually will tell you as the first thing that if you have not been thoughtful, sometimes doing nothing is better than doing something, because you might be causing more damage and just feeling happy about what you're doing without actually achieving the positive impact that you sought out to do. So then, what does this mean for you, right? Or for us? And I would say it's about, to use the buzzword, we are in a business school, so I need to bring in the words, strategy also in my course title, otherwise nobody would sign up for that, right? So thinking strategically about your impact, what does that mean? It actually means the same way, you would think strategically about business, right? In business, when you think strategically, you're looking for an overlap between the mission of your organization, a promising market/industry opportunity, and what is your unique resources and capabilities where you can have a competitive advantage. And you do need to bring exactly that way of thinking when you're trying to have impact, saying, what are the issues that you care about, but then make sure that those issues overlap with a very critical societal need that, not thinking from your point of view, not saying those people need this. It's about like, are those people actually asking for this? Is there a need? Thinking of the people that you're quote unquote trying to help still as customers, even if in some cases they are not the paying customers. And then saying, why you? What do you bring to the table in terms of the solution that, others are not doing? Otherwise, this is not the right allocation of resources in terms of opportunity cost. If your time and money and resources are better spent on something else, then do that. Maybe there's the issue of homelessness in Europe, right closer to home, and maybe you understand that better than access to water in South Africa, and maybe you should work on that if that's where your skills are better at. Or maybe your skill really is being a banker, in which case, be a banker, make a lot of money, and then channel a lot of that money into causes that you care about. Just because you make a lot of money doesn't mean you have to spend a lot of money on yourself, right? And this is the logic that gets used by a global movement called effective altruism. If you Google it, that's what it says. If you're good at being a banker, just be a banker. And if you are willing to move to Cambodia to help low-income people and live there on $10,000 a year, then come up with the equivalent budget for yourself for New York or London, and the rest of the money channel it into something that is well known and well shown, scientifically shown to be effective as a way of development. So but how do we know about the critical societal needs, right? And this is where I think the conversation around sustainable development goals is very useful, because in a way it sets a global agenda on what are things we as humanity care about, right? In a way, that sort of humanity's to-do list. And it's useful to start from there, because then at least you can say, I'm not imagining up a need. This is a need that's well recognized through an international process, a collaborative process. But importantly, the goal here is not to make sure that you, in your annual statement, get to say, or in your annual report, get to say that 7 of these goals are met by me, versus somebody else's organization is only hitting 4 of those, right? That cannot be the KPI. And it's amazing how often that does become the KPI. Like, I am hitting 7 out of the 17 goals, and so on. And at a minimum, you need to double click, and you need to double click and say, what are the specific indicators that I'm going after within that. In this case, let's say you care about maternal mortality ratio, and you just say, okay, and the good news is globally it's a priority. And then you have to identify where is the need the most. And arguably, you will be able to make a bigger difference in working on that issue if it's in Nigeria than in Singapore, because in Singapore, 8 out of 100,000 women die while giving birth to a child, while that number is 917 in Nigeria. Of course, you still need to ask the question, are your skills equally relevant in Nigeria as in Singapore? But it's about starting with the real question of the real node and the real need. And that's just one of the points. Carsten, I agree. So that's not my point of view, just to be clear. This is one point of view, which is called the effective altruism, which is look for the opportunity where you would make the most difference. There's very good differences to do otherwise and to be directly involved. If anything, we are human beings. We might not be able to sustain ourselves working in a job, for example, which we don't like, and expecting that we'll be able to fund something else for 20 years. There might be other reasons. To the extent that that job changes yourself as a person in a way that you don't want to, maybe you wouldn't do that, right? So the point here is, I'm not saying that that's necessarily the best thing to do. All I'm saying is that that's the argument that one particular movement makes, which is sort of which is called the effective effective altruism movement. We'll have time for sort of a longer discussion. Let me go through a few more slides, and then I'm going to pause for reactions on this or any other thing. But one of the things that I want to highlight, and I want to highlight this because I think we as humanity are not paying enough attention to, which is, I think it's reasonable to get specialized in a particular sort of objective, like one of the sustainable development goals, and double clicking on it and so on. But one should not lose sight of the fact that these goals are actually very often very interrelated. And the reason I say that is highlighted in a little bit of what happened at COP26. If any of you saw the live coverage that was happening on the last day, right? It should not have been a surprise that we ended up where we ended up, because for many days leading up to the final day, that was exactly the conversation, which is the poorer countries were saying, look, hang on, the climate problem is essentially caused by the rich people in the richer countries, right? So here's some of the statistics. The richest 1% of the people, most of which historically, not anymore, but historically were based in the richer countries, are projected in 2030 to still have, despite all the noise around net zero and all of that, 30 times the per capita CO2 emissions that we need to reach the 1.5% target. And look at the global average, which is still above, which means that we are not on track for 1.5%. And the poorest 50% are way below that level, right? So climate change is almost entirely a problem caused by the rich people. Now, this is the argument, not surprisingly, a lot of the poor countries would do. And there are different segments of these countries, right? Some are in countries which are, small island countries, which are literally going to disappear in 50 years if the water levels rise. But then, there's another category. And on the last day, this particularly became an issue with India opposing the issue of coal and making people say, no, we can't phase out coal, but in the end, we will agree to phase down coal, which is reduce the emphasis on coal. Because they said, hang on, we don't have the money to overnight switch to renewable energies. Our economy is dependent on coal. Finally, we are at a point where we are starting to have reasonable economic growth. And, the average Indian today might have, the same aspiration for standard of living that people in Europe and US have had for 20 years. So what gives you the right to stop us from doing something that you guys have done from decades, right? So that was that side of the argument. And the important point here is, without going into the details of the politics that subsequently ensued, that there are always multiple perspectives. And very often these perspectives are coming from different pieces in the SDGs, saying, if the Indian perspective was, if we focus too much on climate, we are not able to, have progress as fast as we could on other dimensions. For example, we need the energy, we need the houses to build so that, we solve the problem of housing that a lot of low-income people might have. We need the infrastructure, we need the roads to be able to build our economy and create jobs and all of that, right? So again, the point here is neither to defend India, not to criticize India, but to say that these things are complex. And if you're passionate about climate, the real question to be asking is not how to make Amsterdam a little bit more green. I think, in my view, your time and resources would be much better spent on saying, how do we help figure out a global system where, India finds it in their interest to make Delhi more green. And, that it's already a big problem. And of course, it's not that it's not recognized, but in the priority order, because, we are living on the same earth end of the day. And the issue of development is very intertwined with the issue of climate, right? And this is a point that's made very strongly by this highly influential book by Kate Raworth, which is summarized in one of her TED Talks, which I highly recommend. And she says, we have to view sort of the global challenge that we face across all sustainable development goals like a donut, right? And some of these sustainable development goals are about the outer boundary of the donut that we shouldn't push outside, which is how much can the earth handle in terms of resource utilization or emissions that we generate and so on, while the inner foundation is sort of the minimum standard of living that we as humanity have to strive for all of us. And it, in the end, has to simultaneously sort of meet that balance. Okay, so I'll pause here. I think this is a good natural point to pause for any questions or comments. Disagreements more than welcome. We are among friends. I suggest you raise your hands in Zoom. I think that might be the easiest. And then you just unmute yourself if you'd like to comment. If anybody wants to comment. I have a few thousand other PowerPoint slides, which I can continue as well. No comments? Okay, so I'm happy to keep chugging because I have a few comments about sort of business. How does business fit in all of that, right? And so this is where I think a good starting point of a conversation about business is to bring into picture somebody like Muhammad Yunus, who says, hang on. And as you probably know, Professor Yunus and the Grameen Bank won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2006. And his whole point of view is, it's not about business being good or bad. Business is just a tool. It's your choice how you use the tool. And you can choose to use the tool in a way that it's not just profit maximizing, but it's working towards societal objectives, right? So one of the case studies that I use in my teaching when I talk about it in a way is a poster child of this movement, which Professor Yunus started, which is called social entrepreneurship, but now very often people prefer the word impact entrepreneurship. Is this hospital chain which does about 500,000 surgeries a year, sees about 5 million patients a year, which is called Arvind Eye Care, which is not donor funded. It's completely self-sustaining, but through a cross-subsidized model and through a very professionally run organization which applies the best principles that you would learn, let's say in operations management class at a business school, but combines that with the passion that derives very strongly from spirituality, which is in the DNA of this organization, right? So this organization doesn't make money, it cross-subsidizes, and its focus is on serving even the poorest with the same quality of service clinically, which actually matches clinical outcomes in the UK when it comes to things like cataract surgery. So their focus is very deliberately something that's low cost and high impact intervention, in particular cataract surgery, which we take for granted is available to everywhere, even in India, in the cities, even in middle class. But it turns out not to be the case in a lot of the rural low-income communities in emerging markets, where just this $20 surgery that could have saved eyesight, the absence of that leads to people going blind. So just to give another example, and I'll pause for questions just in another couple of minutes, just after I throw in some more examples. We are among the Dutch Alumni Association event. So a natural example that comes up is Stony Chocolonely, which is the largest chocolate brand in Holland. It's excellent chocolate. At the same time, the whole company actually was started, if you go back to the history of the company, it was started by, I think it was a journalist or a lawyer, I'm forgetting. But the motivation was that we want to build a chocolate company that's ethical in terms of minimizing human trafficking, raising awareness around human trafficking in the cocoa supply chain and working on minimizing it. And the whole brand is built around doing well. At the same time, while making sure it's an excellent product. And that's an important point here, right? So they're not compromising on the quality of the product because we're the do-gooders. And then broader mission is to make all chocolate slave-free, not just theirs, right? So it's a little bit of an activist brand, just like, Patagonia would be in outdoor clothing. Now, the difference between this case and the Arvind's case is this is also being built as a profitable business, right? So the aspiration, whether it's Tony's or whether it's Patagonia, and we can think of many other examples, is to ultimately build a business which is good at doing impact, but in a way that's embedded with the promise in the business school, in the business model or the brand, that it achieves that impact and building a profitable business at the same time. So just in terms of a little bit of vocabulary, I like to make this distinction. These are not necessarily, scientifically defined perfect terms that everybody agrees, but I like to make this distinction between a social enterprise, a term that I use for an organization that's putting impact first, and putting impact first in a context where they see trade-offs and they choose to give up on profitability to have that impact. And Arvind would be an example of that, because they would feel that, yes, we could make more money by serving less of the poorest patients, that we are providing surgeries for free through a cross-subsidy model, but we don't care as much about the money as about the impact. So we're going to stay with that. And impact business would be somebody like Tony's Chocolonely or Patagonia, says our brand promise, our business model fundamentally embeds in it our approach towards impact in a way that there isn't a trade-off, or at least there isn't much of a trade-off, that I can simultaneously build a profitable business at the same time as having impact. Now, the thing that I want to contrast this with is a third category, which is where typically most of the larger public companies would fall, which I'll call sustainable business, where for everything you invariably have to end up justifying why it's consistent with making money, at least in the long term, and consistent with shareholder value. And we've seen leaders pushing the frontier of that. We saw Paul Polman at Unilever. We saw the CEO of Danone. But not surprisingly, in the end, these are all cases where they did sort of have friction with the shareholders to some extent, and it ends up being a delicate balance. Having said that, for a lot of us, especially the ones that work at large companies, it's important to recognize that, yes, the stories of impact entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship might seem sexy. And for sure, there are a lot of circumstances in which there's a lot of impact being made, but it goes back to the question on, am I an entrepreneur? Am I willing to live that kind of lifestyle? Am I willing to go into that kind of venture? Or am I just better at making impact inside larger companies? Now, that impact might be slower impact, more incremental impact, but potentially at a much bigger scale. So again, your impact, given depending on your skills and the issues you tackle, might be larger in these large companies. Just to take a couple of quick examples, if you're at Amazon and you can help Amazon supply chain become better, or you can help improve the facial recognition software at Amazon that came into a lot of criticism for being, to some extent, almost biased against darker skin colors. By the way, this is an issue that has also come up more recently with oximeters, if you've been following BBC. Oximeters, which measure the oxygen level in COVID, it turns out that they are much more accurate with lighter skin than darker skin, right? So this has been sort of a huge global debate as well, right? So this is about, okay, the business already exists. There's a large public business, but invariably the business has a lot of effects on society. And if you can help make a positive difference, in other words, if you can help reduce even the negative effects, that's also impact, because the world is better because of you, right? You don't need the sexy social entrepreneurship stories to say you're having necessarily an impact. Similarly, another example that I've been following recently is Lego, right? So if Lego can make more of its bricks from recycled materials, going more towards a circular economy, or if it can help change the perceptions that of gender roles, a lot of which can be traced back to the toys that children get to play, boys versus girls when they are 3-year-old, when the blue versus pink distinction starts to get made. You're already having an impact on the dimension of gender as a toy company if you're highlighting that issue. And if you're able to highlight in a way that is consistent both with your mission, but also, with making more money, then there doesn't necessarily need to be a trade-off. So, just to summarize this part of the discussion, and here I'll sort of give another pause. So the way I look at the world is that it's a little bit of a spectrum, right? The spectrum on the right-hand side of the spectrum is what I call the invisible hand of the market, where nobody is sitting and saying, what impact am I having on the world, right? So you can imagine the telephone companies and, the mobile phone companies going to sub-Saharan Africa in the earlier years. They went there because that was a large potential market, and they ended up having a huge impact by enabling, financial inclusion, by enabling access to markets for farmers and connectivity for farmers and so on, right? So there's still value being created. So the question is not whether the impact is more on the right or the left, but it's different approaches. And typically we used to think of, there's this invisible hand, Adam Smith market playing, or there is this charity and intentional impact. But I think a lot of the action, and what gets a lot of my students excited in my MBA courses, is the action in the middle. And different people very often might have different preferences or, different aptitude for whether I want to have impact through social enterprise, through an impact business or a sustainable business. But it's important to emphasize that one is not better than the other. They're just different. So you have to go back to the same 3 questions we started with. What real need are you helping fulfill? And is this the right vehicle for that? Does it align with what you're trying to achieve in your life, financial goals and impact goals? And does this align with what your own skills, competitive advantage, resources, and capabilities are? And you really have to maximize that approach. So I will pause here once more. If somebody wants to raise hand, I think it's good to hear some voices rather than me reading paragraphs in the chat. So Carsten, feel free to share any of your questions, because you clearly have a lot on your mind. So. Yeah, go ahead. Did you want to? Rashmi, go ahead.
I think it's well, maybe it's a question that can't be answered right here, but I think the examples you've taken us through are sort of interesting and inspiring. For me, I think the gap is, it still seems like people have quit their day job and started a chocolate company, and quit their day job and done something. So for me, I think more inspiring examples would be, to make it real in my head, is
right.
How do I create impact, right? Like,
right.
I have an MBA. I'm not a particularly skilled person.
Yeah.
I'm not going to. How do I do that?
Yeah. So, I mean, to me, it goes back to, right, this is the point that I was trying to make here, right? If you're doing supply chain in Amazon, and you can help crack the issue of why are we using so much packaging, and can we accomplish the same customer service goals? If I'm coding AI algorithms at Amazon, am I sensitive to the fact that there is this unintended side consequence? And just to take an extreme example, if I was doing self-driving coding for self-driving cars at in Tesla, now it is also a reality that some people have tested some of these algorithms, and it turns out the algorithms are better at detecting lighter skin color than darker skin color. Now think about the implications of that, right? Think about the implications of the kind of accidents that a car would have. And so the point again is, I think just being sensitive, any job touches society in more ways than we realize, right? So normally a supply chain person at Amazon, much less so a software coder at Amazon or Google, would think about the biases its code might be producing. Or somebody who's marketing toys at a toy company might be doing. I mean, just to give another example that I use as a case study in my teaching sometimes is Accenture came up with this organization called Accenture Development Partnerships within this overall umbrella. And it came up to that because of an entrepreneur by the name Gib Bullock, who's written a book. I think it is something entrepreneur. If you Google his name, Gib Bullock, B-U-L-L-O-C-H. And what he essentially did was he said, okay, I see a lot of people who come into consulting, then want to quit or want to take a sabbatical to make a positive difference because they feel disillusioned that they are very focused, on just making money for their corporate clients. And I'm going to start a development consulting practice within Accenture. And the way I'll do it is I'll set it up as not as a cost center, but as something that's still meant to, at a minimum, break even. And then I'm going to, in addition, show, and for this he partnered with I worked on that project with him and his team to show the human capital benefits in terms of, in particular, retention and motivation of employees. And then he goes back to the corporate leadership at Accenture and saying, you should allow this project because we will make sure that it breaks even. And yes, UNICEF and Gates Foundation and all of these organizations might not have the same paying capacity as Shell or IBM for the projects, but they can still pay, let's say, a third of what we would normally charge our corporate clients. Our employees are so excited that they are willing to take a salary cut of, let's say, 50% for the duration of that project. And then there's this intangible human capital benefit. So can we come up with a business model where the combination of tangible and intangible benefits, which we help him quantify, justifies running a project, which then brings professional expertise from the business sector to the development sector. And this helped him, execute, I think cumulatively just within the first 10 years or maybe a little more than that, they're done about 1,000 consulting projects. While if these were just pro bono consulting projects, maybe they would have done 20, right? And this is a model that, in some form, some other organizations have subsequently adopted as well. Now, I'm not saying that it's easy. That the reality is if you're doing it in a large company, you would always have to think about the business case. But I would say, I think thinking about the business case very often requires thinking more broadly than the immediate cash flows. Sometimes the cash flows might be there, but I think it's about sort of quantifying sometimes the intangible benefits. Like in this case, I mentioned the intangible benefits about human capital, and then moving in that direction. Not easy by any means, but I think this would be an example of that. Sebastian?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. Thanks a lot. Very interesting so far. I just have a question about the recent tweet from Elon Musk, where he says he will donate 6 billion of his Tesla shares if the World Food Program can explain how they will solve world hunger with that money. I just wonder what's your opinion about this tweet, and how would you comment on that? What was the reason behind that from your perspective?
Okay, so one of the questions one could say. So again, for this, I would need to know, first of all, so there's it's a very complex question, right? Because there's many layers in there. But if you look at it from an effective altruism lens, the question would be, here's a billionaire who's made a lot of money, and I genuinely think he doesn't care about money. I think he genuinely is care of, my limited view of him is he actually cares about impact. Now, a lot of people would criticize him for his definition of impact, and priorities of impact might not be right? Sometimes. In this particular case, he's saying, okay, if I make a lot of money, and if you're telling, and if my majority of my followers on Twitter are saying that's the right thing for me to do, I'll do it, right? The effective altruism person would say two things. First is World Food Program the right thing to be putting money in from a pure impact point of view? And then there's one layer higher, question, which is a more systemic question than just the Elon Musk question, on is aid the right development model in the first place, right? Should the approach to feed hungry people around the world just be distributed world? And this is why I'm saying I don't know enough about world food. What's the exact name? Sorry. World Food Program, right?
Yeah.
World Food Program. I don't know how their programs work. Are there programs, for example, in some communities where people are not, literally dying from hunger, are they willing and able and interested in broadening the programs to saying, okay, how do we help create more sustainable livelihood systems or agricultural systems, or invest in new kind of crops that would actually solve the hunger problem? Because there's no doubt that there's a major food crisis that humanity is facing going forward. There just isn't enough food. If you think of it as countries develop, countries will take more demand more protein, and I mean that's sort of the story behind impossible food and Beyond Meat in a way, right? That there isn't, as people get richer, they're just it's already bad enough, and if the demand for protein keeps on going up, you can't have enough protein from meat. So I think it goes into those kind of issues. And then, the broader issues of, do we want billionaires to save the world, or, what about the democratic system? What about the overall society? Should we be so dependent on Gates saying this year I want to fix malaria and 3 years later I want to fix something else, versus, these priorities should be held through some other more inclusive process? So many dimensions. I mean, I don't know if those reactions are
yeah,
useful.
maybe we can meet on campus next year.
Happy
so I will start.
Yeah.
Happy to have a
So
longer conversation.
that could be a 2-hour conversation in itself, right? Leroy?
Yeah, thank you. It's on this slide, actually, intentionality spectrum. And I find it quite interesting because obviously you have some very explicit intentions, but then some very subtle intentions.
Yeah.
My question kind of draws on kind of today's society, in the sense that we've obviously had COP26 with all these urgent issues. And I think society, particularly the younger generations, have much more of an expectation from businesses to have an intentional impact. So my question is, does this kind of framework that's on the screen now serve the urgency of the issues from both a scientific and kind of public perspective? Or do you think the strategic intentions from even the most subtlest ends needs to increase to address the issues we're facing?
So my view is, so first of all, this is meant to be a descriptive and not a normative, in the sense that this is how the world is. Let's face it, right? So this is sort of the current version of capitalism in which we are, and that we will be, at least in the near future. So the question to me is, will this solve the world's problem? And no, the business on its own will not solve the world's problem. The distinction to me, and by the way, with the disclaimer that these boundaries are blurry, and incidentally, exactly the same story holds on the finance side, right? So I could do a lecture on impact investing. It would be exactly the same conversation, saying, is sustainable, responsible investing or impact investing, impact business, sustainable business is going to save the world? No. Are social enterprises going to save the world? No, it will always be too small, right? So what's needed? I mean, what's needed is all of this, but not to a point where it crowds out, let's say, policy, right? It crowds out the role of governments. I think the most dangerous narrative is, since these guys are doing it, governments don't need to do anything. And I would argue that today, all the noise that's happening, especially around net zero, right, around sustainable business, about everybody's getting so excited about ESG. Part of the reason is that they can see the writing on the wall. The regulation is coming. It's already there in Europe, pretty much, right? And so it has become like, okay, the regulation is coming in 3, 4, 5 years. So if I don't clean up my act now, and my competitors do, in 3 years, I'll be out of business, because the competitors will already be meeting the regulatory requirements and I will not be, right? So I don't think Shell is talking about net zero from the goodness of their heart, right? In some abstract sense, right? Given the system, they're doing it because it just makes sense that, once the regulatory framework tightened, there is a clear business case. So I would argue that this business case that I was talking about inside the company, making that business case becomes easier when there's the right regulatory framework, the right systems level conversations. And by the way, a lot of it can also be just sector level. It doesn't necessarily have to be regulatory, but then it has to be pre-competitive, right? Then you're not saying, hey, I'm the good guy who takes on, in some settings, there's a win-win, but in other settings, there's a real cost. And if I'm the guy who takes on the cost, and the implication of that is I go out of business because the other guy is now more competitive, then what have we achieved as a society? And the solution is we have to find a way to level the playing field. One way is to do more sector level efforts, for sure, which will take us, I think, further than individual level efforts. But then the another layer is we absolutely need government action and so on. I think the way EU is thinking about it is exactly in the right direction. The tricky thing is, just like markets fail, I think the governments also fail, right? Especially when it comes to collaboration around regulation, because the goals are different, right? Europe and US is panicking about environment. India cares about environment, but India also cares about development, and that already creates some divergence in how fast does coal need to go off the face of Earth, right? So I think it's not that this is wrong. I think this is incomplete. So, but I'm obviously focusing on this because I'm thinking more from the business point of view. But at a minimum, what we need to make sure is business doesn't undermine regulatory efforts. And I think that's the most dangerous thing, where there's active lobbying behind the scenes. Some people would argue the reason the final text of COP26 talks about coal but not oil is that the oil lobby is just too strong still. Coal is just not strong enough. So you were able to bring coal in. Why is there no mention of phasing out oil in there? Because there's just too many powerful countries and too many powerful companies that still have a stake on the ground in oil. Lucy?
Hi, thank you, Dr. J. What I would like to bring is the following. Every time I'm in a conversation like that, it makes me think of this book here. I don't know if you can see, The End of Poverty, Jeffrey Sachs. It would end by 2025. No? So I think we can change the theme now to climate and so on and so forth. And the whole time, what comes up to my mind is the following. I made a move from traditional business. I've been a corporate executive for many years, and now I work with a client that is philanthropy. And what I have learned is that not that business is evil, but that where we can make an impact is understanding our personal impact and understand what we can do as people that have been studying in business schools, understand how business is done, how economic models are created and developed and implemented, and our strong influence in changing the things we are doing on a day-to-day basis. You just mentioned what Accenture does. McKinsey also does this kind of things. Yeah. But I also think that, okay, we can also do that on a larger scale. So Accenture as a company, McKinsey as a company, or each one of us here as an individual, as a company in itself, what we advise, what we sell, what we suggest, what is the impact that in the world? Yeah, and absolutely. I think that's what we should not behave like Jeffrey and think that we need something big to change the world. I think we have a tremendous influence, and that's why we are failing as individuals and as society, because we think that's not with us. It's with others to solve. It's with the government to solve. It's with Bill Gates to solve. So I mean,
for sure. And by the way, just on Jeffrey Sachs itself, right? So that book is not accepted book among mainstream development economists, right? Because they said that the model Jeffrey Sachs was proposing was a very top-down model, and just saying give development more money and the problems will be solved. And there's a point of view, as I said, and Play Pump is an example exactly counter to that movement, saying it's not about the more money. It's about to the extent that we are relying on aid, it has to be very selective, very focused, and with a very clear agenda on why do we need aid. And by the way, is it really helping the people that we intend to help, rather than just going in the pockets of dictators, which is what ends up happening with a lot of aid money, right? So that's the broader. But you're right. I think it's also about similarly now, the issue is not about, I think, some person sitting in the chair solving all of the world's problems. I think it's about the people that are in power, which is people like us, people like, businesses rule the world. The reality, that's the reality. There's a large enough fraction of that people, A, that should care, B, be well informed on the issues, because just caring is not enough. Because with caring, the problem is you will end up spending your time and energy doing things which in the bigger scheme of things are not solving the problems, and you're feeling good about yourself. And one of the examples I give here, this was my next slide, so in a way it's a natural transition, if I may give that, is this issue of environmental impact, right? And a lot of people are just saying, hey, we're flying more, let's start doing carbon offset, problem solved, right? And that's a very cheap trick. Carbon offsets is not going to save the world, right? That's just the reality. But it's one of those things that if we don't sufficiently, it's a well-meaning initiative for most of us, right? We just say, no, I do need to fly. And I'm not saying that we should fly or shouldn't fly. We are all on our journeys. But at the systems level, there are too many things wrong with this. One is, A, the pricing is wrong, right? Carbon offsets are way too cheap relative to what scientists say needs to be done. And B, it, by the way, accentuates the inequality problem, because effectively what you're saying is the rich will not change their behavior, but they are going to pay off the poor people so that they don't generate more carbon footprint, right? I mean, that's sort of one interpretation of some of this, right? So what's happening here is, if you go back to this, I mean, this is the fundamental challenge. Just purely looking at the emissions part of the climate debate, right? Which is the atmosphere, think of it as a bathtub, and the carbon is the water in the bathtub. And the reality, if you look at the budget for a 1.5% future, we've filled up half of this bathtub, right? So the question is, how far are we going to continue filling up the bathtub? Who's going to fill up the bathtub? How far will we empty the water? Because the faster we empty the water, the more we can continue to fill the bathtub. And who's going to, empty the bathtub? And this becomes important, because now if you go back to this question of net zero pledges, the details are in the fine print. How are people achieving the net zero pledges? So in this case, if you're inside a business, you can think of 3 ways you can say, I'm going to hit net zero. The first is, and that's the cheapest trick, but that's becoming very hard now because everybody now talks about scope 3 emissions and so on, is just simply saying, I'm going to get out of the parts of the value chain where the pollution is happening. I'll let the Chinese do that stuff. I'm going to focus on the clean stuff, right? But that you get called out on. So that's the first one, right? Which is, this solves nothing because your value chain is still there. You just don't own it. You're not showing it on your books. The second is the offsetting emissions. And there also, there are a lot of problems. Do you really believe when a fossil fuel company says, my natural gas is carbon neutral because I have planted some trees somewhere? There's so many challenges with that issue, right? Carbon offsets is a really complex territory. First, just planting trees at the expense of ecosystems doesn't work. Second, even if you're planting trees, who's guaranteeing the trees will be there for like the next 40 years? Because if the trees are going to be either cut down by somebody or burned down in a forest fire in a few years, you have achieved absolutely nothing. Then if you plant more trees here, if the people that were going to cut trees in this forest now cut the trees somewhere else, you've again achieved nothing, right, at the systems level. And finally, by the way, if you're paying somebody to adopt renewable energy and there's already a business case for renewable energy that they would have adopted, your additionality, to use the jargon from this space, is zero, right? So, and the point again is not to say that offsetting emissions doesn't have a role, but it's one of those things again, that it's a band-aid and it's a transition device that, once you make sure it's sufficiently high quality, has a useful role to play as we transition towards net zero. But that in itself is not going to, solve the climate crisis. So we absolutely need to be thinking about reducing emissions. So where is that in the business world? In the business world, roughly there are 2 categories of things that are happening. One is sort of the Bill Gates view of the world, And I like his approach of break it down by sector, look at what is the green premium, and very selectively using philanthropic capital or concessionary capital to enable innovation to reduce this quote unquote green premium, so that the more carbon neutral technologies come closer in cost to the carbon positive technologies. And then, of course, there's this conversation more broadly about the circular economy. And, we as consumers need to be consuming less. But, more importantly, as a system, the entire system should be built in a way that, products have longer lives. You're not building what you don't need to build, you repair more, and ultimately recycle more, right? But recycling should not be a feel-good sort of thing. Recycle comes last in the order of things in which you reduce your carbon footprint on the world. And while all of this is happening, one of the things to again recognize is this just Band-Aid, or will this really solve the problem? And I think here it's somewhat strongly written, but I find this book useful. This is one of the books that I read this year, The New Climate War from Michael Mann. And what his point of view is, actually, we have to be a little bit careful. We need to hold the companies more accountable, because right now there's too much focus on the individual and reducing individual carbon footprint, which, while important, is not enough. And then in this particular book, which has been highlighted elsewhere as well, he gives the example of, there was this campaign called the Crying Indian Ad in the US in the 1970s, I think, or 80s, when plastic bottles had just, plastic litter was becoming a big problem. And there was legislation on the cards that the state governments in the US would hold the software companies, for example, accountable for making sure that they go and bring the plastic back, rather than the plastic just sort of causing all the litter everywhere. And at least in one version of the story, a lot of these campaigns, which were putting individual responsibility at the center to say, look what you've done, you've taken the land from which, the native Indians used to preserve as natural land, and you've completely littered it. So we need to get better at cleaning up our litter and all of that. That was the messaging. It turns out that the funding of a lot of those campaigns was ultimately coming, at least in the version that I've read in a few sources, ultimately coming from the Coca-Colas of the world, right? Which is, corporates were essentially framing the issue as an individual responsibility issue, so that business didn't have to do anything. And by the way, a very similar story has happened with the personal carbon footprint. That's a term that was devised by BP, right? Think about it, right? An oil company, why would an oil company in a big way push this whole agenda of individual footprint? Because then it's not the oil company's responsibility anymore, right? So, and this is not to say individual responsibility is not important, but this is exactly why it shouldn't replace systems level change and policy level responsibility and so on. Karsten, go ahead. Karsten, you're still muted.
So, yes, first of all, thank you very much, Jasjit. You're really, well, putting us to think again where we are in this world. I don't know really where to start, but one of the things is that I see a dilemma between the way we have organized society today, which is free enterprise and liberalism, which, by the way, in the heart, I still very much support, but at the same time, liberalism and capitalism is at the expense of societal needs and liberalism of others, right? So I was wondering what your view on this is, because as you say, it's not going to be enough that we have social entrepreneurialism and what have you. So yeah. So yes, please.
Okay,
your
thank
view
you.
on this.
I couldn't have planted better questions because your questions keep on going back to the next PowerPoint slide I have. So I get to show all of my slides anyway. Okay, so this, I promise this is the last stretch, but I think it directly relates to your point and you know, shares my point of view. My point of view is, so, and this is what we were talking about, right? A lot of what's happening in terms of initiatives is sort of happening at the top or the middle of this iceberg, right? And a lot of the action is at the bottom of the iceberg. Now, and you know, this is the kind of diagram the systems thinking people like to say, saying, you know, it's ultimately about much more fundamental transformation. Now, the question then becomes, what is a more fundamental transformation, right? One is, if you go to the real extreme, then somebody will say, you know, oh, you know, capitalism has failed. I mean, but that's like, okay, but tell me the alternative, right? So we've tried alternatives and they've done worse than capitalism, right? So capitalism has failed, except that it's better than everything else that we've tried out. It's a little bit like democracy. People talk about democracy as well, right? And so to me, the question goes back to, my view is, I think it has to be, so first of all, I'm a huge fan of this notion of intentionality, right? I think business is a tool, end of the day. I think if there's enough business people who are thinking about it as a tool in a system where the employees, the customers, the communities, the policymakers, they're all sufficiently sensitive to really understanding what's happening in the society as a whole and raising awareness, right? So just raising awareness. So for example, right now, if most of the campaigns are about, as long as you recycle your plastic bottles, it's okay to keep on consuming more plastic bottles. Those are problematic, right? But my view is, I think a combination of people who genuinely want to make a positive difference, even within the business community, and those people being supported by a broader societal context, more educated customers, more educated communities, more educated employees, combined with a tighter regulatory framework that supports the good guys that want to do the right things. I think you need all of those pieces to work together. And I think what we don't need, and I'll put in this picture, I mean, just to say what I'm contrasting this with. So, and you know, the reason I have this picture of an auto rickshaw driver in Mumbai, this is not this specific guy. I mean, I picked this picture up off the net. But what had happened was, I went to one of the MBA class trips to India, building business in India, right? So there's this building business MBA courses, right? And we were sitting in a 5-star hotel at night. People were having $20 tequila shots and bragging about how they were able to use their skills from the MBA negotiations course to get better prices out of the auto rickshaw drivers in Mumbai who were asking for $2, and these guys were able to negotiate it down to $1 for like a 15-minute ride, and feeling proud about it. I think that's where the problem is, right? Which is, I think there's something fundamentally wrong with that. And to the extent that we at business schools are guilty of accepting and perhaps even encouraging that way of thinking, I think it's a problem. I think it has to start first with getting back to our humanity. And then the second is getting back to this notion that when we are doing impact, we're not doing anybody any favor, right? And I think we need to have much more education in ethics. That's my view in particular, and philosophy, right? On what is a good life. And this in particular, John Rawls defines justice as saying, okay, if we didn't know what we are going to be born as, right? The lottery of birth had not happened. What is the system we would design, right? And if we approach this whole notion that way, right? Recognizing that I'm successful, maybe because I'm smart, even that one can question how much credit I can take for. But certainly to some extent, I was born in a supportive family. I got to go to, good schools. I got the right opportunity. I was lucky enough to crack an exam that took me to the right college. Some admissions officer picked my application file rather than somebody else, even though both of those files were equally good and all of that. I think once you go with that attitude rather than impact as something doing somebody else a favor, I think it has to go back to those values and humility. Ultimately, one of the things that I was talking even last week when I was teaching to INSEAD social entrepreneurship program, I said, in my view, the single most important skill that's needed to have social impact is humility. I mean, it's not obvious, right? There's a lot of people who would put a lot of skills before that. But I think when people are coming from a sense of arrogance and I know better and this is how life should be, which I see, to be honest, a lot of people in the business world, when they come into the sustainability impact world, they bring, some of them end up bringing those values that you guys, you don't know what climate change is. You guys don't understand how poverty will be solved. I built the largest company in the world, and here I am now. I'm going to tell you how to use those skills to solve the problems you've been working on because I'm just smarter than you, and you have nothing to teach me. And I think that's where the real issue lies. Anyway, I don't know if it's useful, but I think that's how I'm thinking. I mean, I've been struggling with this. This is a very hard problem. But I don't think the answer is to give up on business because I don't think we have a better solution. I think the issue is business as a tool, but I think business as a tool can be usefully employed only if people are going to reward the good guys, which requires a combination of educating the people on what really is a good guy versus who is just acting to be a good guy, and a regulatory framework that also keeps incentives sufficiently aligned with that.
Jasjit, I don't want to interrupt you, but I think that's a fantastic place to finish.
Yeah, and I noticed we had plans to do group work as well, but I think we ended up having a lot of exciting discussion just in the forum. So we'll just leave it at that. Yeah.
Well, I thank you again. I think that was remarkably thought-provoking. And it will probably take time actually for it to settle in and for us to reflect on the amount of material that's gone through in the last 90 minutes. Particularly, it causes us to think about what is impact and what does business as a force for good really mean. You know, clearly good intentions aren't good enough, but how do you turn good intentions into impact? Another important theme. And two things to finish with. It's one, that identifying the social need is absolutely critical, and I thank you for reiterating that. And your final point about humility, I think, is one that again we need to reflect on and our own approach. So, fantastic way to spend an hour and a half. Really timely for us. Thank you very much for your input here. I'm sure I'm speaking for all the alumni, and it's such a huge topic. I hope that we can follow up and think about how we follow up indeed this session and where we can go from here.
Thank you so much, and thank you for I think insightful discussion. And I apologize I didn't get to a lot of comments in the chat, but hopefully this will be a dialogue, and people connecting from 22D, please sign up for my elective, which is in May, June. So it will be in May, June. So looking forward to seeing many of you there.
And can the alumni look out for a future pop-up course?
Absolutely. I think the alumni course is determined by lifelong learning, depending on how much pressure they feel from alumni wanting to have it one more time. So if you are actually interested, I am sure it can be done. They'll probably need to get emails from you. Otherwise, they won't have any signal of there is still market demand. They feel that I've done it 4 times already, so we are done here with business as a force for good. But I think always I'm more than happy to come back again as long as there's demand.
Okay, well, with that, thank you again, Jasjit. And
thank you, Jasjit.
Thank you.
Bring
Bye,
this
everyone.
to a close.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.